In part one of the Richie Benaud story, the Australian sporting icon remembered his introduction to horse racing.
I'd never been to a race meeting before I went with Lindsay Hassett's side to England in 1953, and Harve backed the winner of the Derby that year, and he got me interested in horse racing. And there were two people. Keith Miller was another one, and Miller and Harvey combined, I suppose.
Richie paid tribute to some of his racing favourites.
The Gundawindi Grey nickname that captivated me first, and then I just took an interest in everything he did. He was an exciting sort of horse.
He was. And he loved the attention and loved the publicity, and he would literally bow to a cameraman.
Yeah.
Amazing animal.
He reflected on his very first test wicket.
Alfred Valentine. Lovely guy, and I've always said the best number 11 ever to play test cricket.
You've dined out on that one.
I have.
Yeah.
Richie recalls some of the highlights of his distinguished career.
In my last summer, I made enough runs. Doing the double is the thing, 2,000 runs and 200 wickets. And I achieved that when the South Africans were out in Brisbane Test 1963. And it's something that I've treasured, to be the first in the history of the game to do that.
Your career in journalism began in England with the News of the World and the BBC. In Australia, you worked on the Old Sydney Sun doing police rounds with Noel Bailey.
Yes, I did. And in 1956, that's the year television started in Australia. And I wanted to be part of it. And we were over in England, and Laker bowled us out at Old Trafford, getting 19 wickets, and Lockie got one. But because we then had to go to Karachi to play a test on the mat, and to India to play 5 test matches, they magnanimously gave the players 3 weeks off. And I was with a fellow called Tom Sloan and 1 or 2 others having a few drinks one night. And I said to him, Tom, you're the head of light entertainment. What is the chance of you organising a television course for me to do? He said, well, the official one is over now. He said, but I can put together one for you if you're going to be here 3 weeks, which I was. And I worked on this every day of the week from 11 a.m. to midnight, sitting with producers and doing all sorts of things. But that was where it all began. And it was one of the most valuable things that's ever happened to me. When I came back to Australia, I went straight in to see Lindsay Clinch, who was the editor. And I'd been working in the counting house at the Sun newspaper, and I'd been at Lindsay to give me a transfer to the editorial. And he'd said, no, not until you have a good tour. When you have a good tour? Well, I bowled out India in the last test match, got 10 or 11 wickets, and did well. Then we got straight onto the plane and flew back to Sydney. So when I went in to see Lindsay Clinch, he didn't look up, he just kept on doing things. So I stood in front of his desk for, must have been 2-3 minutes. And then he looked up and he said, I suppose you've come in to ask again for a transfer to the editorial. I said, yes, I have, Mr. Clinch. He said, well, I keep my word. And he said, you've had a good tour, so you'll have a transfer to the editorial. And he said, do you know Jack Toohey, the news editor? I said, yes, I know Jack. He said, all right, go out and see him and he'll find something for you to do. And I had my hand on the door, opening it to go out and see Jack Toohey, and Clinch's voice behind me said, he's expecting you. And when I got out there, Jack said, oh, this is absolutely great. He said, we've organised it so that you'll work with Noel Bailey, the police roundsman. You'll be doing that for 4 years. and you'll be able to write a column as well, a sports column. But you'll work with Noel Bailey because he's the best police roundsman in Australia, and that's what I did.
When you left cricket in 1964, you threw yourself headlong into your career as a journalist and commentator, dividing your time between Australia and England for a long time.
Yes, it's only recently that Chris Broad, the match referee, and a journalist from BBC wrote a book called And Welcome to the Highlights. And in that, the head of BBC, when they approached him about it, he said, and I'll give you access to every confidential file in BBC Sport, which they had. And it's only because of that that I found that Peter Dimmock, head of sport in the south, and Brian Cowgill, head of sport in the north, had talked about me, and because it was all minuted. What are we going to do with this guy Benaud? And they said, well, there's nothing for him this year, but next year the West Indies are coming. Frank Walsh bringing the side. And because of the tired test and the fact that Benaud's done so many interviews for us in 1961 when we were touring, I think it'd be a good idea to start him in 1963 when the West Indies are here, and that's exactly what happened. They made me an offer, and I did television for BBC from 1963 to 1999, 36 years.
I think I read somewhere once that of all the sports commentators you've watched and observed, the one you learned the most from was a race caller, Peter O'Sullivan.
What I picked up from Peter O'Sullivan was some of the most valuable things I could possibly have. When I was talking earlier about the 1956 things and going on the unofficial course with the BBC, Peter O'Sullivan was a sound broadcast man then. He hadn't moved into television. He might have done 1 or 2 interviews or things like that. But they sent me down to Newbury in the last few days of the work I was doing there. And the producer said, come along. He said, I'll take you and introduce you to Peter O'Sullivan. So he did, and then he turned and went away. Peter O'Sullivan said, they tell me you're going to be dragging on my coattails for the next 2 days. Could I make a simple request? And I said, yes, certainly, Mr. O'Sullivan. He said, don't speak one word to me all day. So I looked at him.
Sounds like a race caller.
So I looked at him and I said, oh, Mr. O'Sullivan, I'll do that. Yes, he said, there's another part to it though. He said, at the end of the day, we will go and have a couple of beers or whatever you might like to drink, and it'll be a case of going through your notebook and all the things you've written about me and what I did, and we'll know then whether it's been worth doing the 2 days. He was the best organised man I've ever known in the media, and I certainly do things still the way Peter O'Sullivan taught me from the organisational point of view.
Richie, you staunchly believe that the cricket fans the world over are entitled to watch their beloved sport on free-to-air television. Now, you decided to end your British media career in 2005 when Channel 4 lost the rights to B Sky B. You were quite upset.
Well, I don't think these things happen, so there's no point in being upset about them. I was disappointed that I'd done the 33 years with BBC and then 5 years with Channel 4, and Channel 4 had, we knew that they'd won the rights, but Mr. Murdoch whacked down an enormous sum of money on the table, and B Sky B had them. So it was it was a disappointment, but there was nothing could be done about it. And it wasn't a case of they didn't ask me to come and see them, and I didn't contact them to see if I could go and see them. I just cut it off. They do a very, very good job in England. They've got people doing the work now, David Gower and Michael Holding and all sorts of people who are absolutely brilliant at their job, Michael Atherton. So all these guys, they do a terrific job. They've got great knowledge of cricket, and they introduced some things that Channel 9 have copied, one of which was to have 3 commentators. And one of the things I worked on there was where was the best place to sit in 3 commentators. And for me, it's always number 3, which is furthest away from the lead commentator. Let's say Michael Slater's the lead commentator, Mark Taylor is there, and I'm always on the end. And the reason for that is, it may not be a particularly good reason, but it allows me to do 2 or 3 things. I can watch my 2 co-commentators and see if they're going to open their mouths and say something. I can see the whole of the ground as a vista without anything impeding me. And a couple of other little things that just sort of fit in with that. But I'm always on the end, furthest away from the main commentator.
1967 was a very significant year in your life. You married Daphne Surfleet, who had worked in sports publishing. How did Daff become interested in cricket?
Ooh, it goes back, it goes back a long way. When she was a schoolgirl, and one of her school friends, another girl, her father had been given the job of looking after the girls, 2 or 3 of them, and he decided to take them, it was on a Sunday, decided to take them across to a place near Headingley, Round Hay Park, where there was a benefit match on. And Duff sat there and watched and was enthralled by the cricket because Brian Close hit a century, including 14 sixes at Round Hay Park. So cricket got another convert, and Duff, in the cricket side of things, she's been personal assistant and secretary to 7 international cricket team managers. And from the television point of view, she was the first woman ever sent by BBC Television Manchester to do the proper BBC course. First woman, she knows a bit about television, and she also knows a bit about cricket, and they're big bits, I can tell you.
Yeah. After the Australian Cricket Board refused to accept Channel 9's bid to gain the exclusive rights to Test matches, Kerry Packer dropped a bombshell. He set up his own series by secretly signing deals with some leading players from all of the cricketing countries. And there were some very big names among those signings. Probably the biggest at the time was the England captain himself.
Yeah, Tony Gregg, and he did a lot of work in the lead-up, recruiting players, and we had a situation where I knew absolutely nothing about World Series cricket.
It was meant to be top secret, and it obviously was.
Well,
they kept the lid on it.
I reckon I knew something about everything that was happening in cricket. I had no idea about this. A week before I first really met Kerry Packer, I'd been going out to hit golf balls. Belonged to the same golf club, but we didn't know one another. It was just hello, how are you? So he's talking to another guy. The guy's got his back to me, and I've taken my practice bag and a few clubs down, hit some balls. And Kerry saw me coming and he said, "Morning, Richie, how are you?" I said, "Fine, thanks, Kerry." And the guy with him turned around and said, "Richie, how are you?" It was Mark McCormick, the sports agent and the fellow who was manager to umpteen
Superstar sportsman, yeah.
So we chatted and he said, "Great to see you and kind regards to Daphne. Is she okay?" I said, "Yes, fine, thanks." And I went down and hit balls. I only found out later what they were doing was working out which plane the people who were working for Kerry would have to catch to get to the West Indies to sign up the West Indies team. So I've gone down and hit balls. Can't even remember if I hit lousy balls, but that's what it was. And it was about a week later when voice on the other end of the telephone says, "Kerry Packer here, need to see you." And I said, "Well, I'll pop in tomorrow." No, I need to see you within the hour. So I went in there and there's half a dozen players who had signed. So I looked at them and, "G'day."
You knew them all, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was when he told me about World Series cricket. So I had no idea.
Well, he released the news to the world on a now famous date, the 9th of May 1977, just as the Aussie squad was preparing to go to England for the Ashes series. 13 of the 17 players in the squad had already signed.
That's right.
With World Series cricket.
Yeah.
Australia lost that series, so the establishment were feeling very sick.
Yes, there wasn't a great deal of love between World Series cricket and the establishment, but it was one of those things where a week after I said I'd go back and talk to Daphne about it, and he said, I said it was confidential. I said, "Well, in that case, forget it." So I went back and talked to Daphne, and I'd been writing and talking for, 77, for 9-10 years about the disgraceful way players were treated, that they were paid no money, they weren't particularly liked by the establishment, and they had children to bring up, send to school, all the expenses that are around these days, but there was no money. And I'd been writing for a long time that this is one of the more ridiculous things there's ever been, and they've got to pay the players more money. And administrators would say to me, "I didn't like the piece you wrote the other day about paying the players more." I said, "Well, so what? I'll be writing it again next week." So I was well ahead of that. So it was one of those things that when I decided to sign, it was because of all the things I'd been feeling and writing about for many years.
World Series cricket took the establishment to court in London. Kerry Packer didn't attend, but he sent 3 very high-profile representatives.
Yes, there was Tony Gregg and John Snow and Mike Proctor, and they were there for the plaintiffs. The judge was Justice Slade, and I was confident. Not too many people were confident that we were going to win the case, but I was confident because I'd been across in England year after year when there were restraint of trade decisions, but only for footballers.
Yeah.
So Justice Slade, he set out 9 things that he was going to judge, and he gave details of them to the World Series Cricket Group and also to the heads of each country. So they all knew that this guy was going to be the judge, and all 9 things, and quite complex. And World Series cricket won all 9. And that was, I suppose you could say, it was beyond our wildest dreams and hopes. But on each of them, Justice Slade gave his ruling and why he'd made the ruling. And the people in England and right round the world were astonished that this had happened. But when they read the rulings, they knew there was no point in appealing.
Your role as a consultant to World Series cricket was diversified. Probably the most significant thing you did was rewrite the rule book.
Well, one of the things we weren't allowed to do was use the laws of cricket because they're copyrighted. So, yes, as far as they mattered to World Series cricket, and I rewrote them, and then we put them into book form and pamphlet form, so that all the players had them, and then it couldn't be said that we were using something that was copyrighted.
The whole thing was prolonged and very unpleasant on occasions. Kerry had an odd victory along the way, but plenty of obstacles. He couldn't even call his side Australia.
That's true, but that didn't surprise me because the Australian Cricket Board, or the Board of Control, as it was so aptly named in those days, they had the name Australia registered in all their papers and books and everything, and copyrighted, which is just the sort of thing you do. So, no, our team wasn't called Australia, it was World Series Cricket Australians or something along those lines.
Kerry Packer realised that World Series cricket needed to be a game of big hitting and fast bowling. So your beloved leg spin didn't get a look in.
Well, that was only because I wasn't playing then. I might have been a World Series cricket leg spinner.
Yeah. What were the best things to come out of World Series cricket?
The game and the way it changed for the players, that they were able to be paid and paid a proper amount of money, fair pay, you might call it, but it was also fair play. And that was the thing he was so insistent on, and that's why cricketers are well off now.
When you got that initial phone call from him, when he offered you a consultancy with World Series cricket, you said you barely knew him. Did you get to know him? Did you really get to know him over the next few years?
Oh yeah, and found him a very good companion. He is a hard man with regard to the fact that he was running World Series cricket, wanted to be a success, and it was knowing him and seeing the way he worked and sort of judging the way he thought, then I just think he was terrific for the game.
Who came up with the idea of the now famous cream sports jacket?
Well, it might be a famous cream sports jacket now, but it started off because Kerry Packer wanted the presenter to be dressed slightly differently from the other commentators, so that you could pick out what he was wearing. And it started off as a blue jacket, and then it became a light blue jacket and a grey jacket, and Kerry still wasn't happy, so it was decided that I would go to Cutler's in Ben Street in the city and talk to them, and that was how it came about. They came up with the pocket and the cream sports jacket, but it had been 4 other colours before it became cream.
Richie Benaud, fulfilment is probably the most precious thing that any of us can aspire to at the end of a long working life. I can't help but feel that your fulfilment is now complete.
I hope not. I hope there's a bit more to come.